Everyone gasped when they saw the kitten on the seventh floor balcony. Then something shocking happened. The morning sun filtered through gauzy curtains, casting warm patches of light across Helen Cooper's living room floor. Her new companion, Mochi, a 4-month-old gray tabby with emerald eyes, pounced from one sunbeam to another, her bell-adorned collar jingling with each playful leap. Helen watched from her favorite armchair, a worn but comfortable piece that had witnessed decades of her life story. At 73, she hadn't expected to find such joy in a kitten's antics, but Mochi had brought an unexpected vibrancy to her quiet 7th-floor apartment. "Careful with those curtains, little one," Helen called out softly as Mochi batted at the flowing fabric. The kitten paused, turning those intelligent green eyes toward her before promptly ignoring the warning and continuing her assault on the innocent drapery. Helen couldn't help but chuckle. Since bringing Mochi home from the shelter 3 weeks ago, laughter had once again become a regular part of her daily routine. The apartment, once filled with the echoing silence and memories of her late husband, George, now resonated with the pitter-patter of tiny paws and enthusiastic purrs. Rising from her chair, Helen made her way to the kitchen, her steps measured but steady. "Time for breakfast, isn't it?" she called out. Mochi immediately abandoned her curtain campaign, racing ahead to weave between Helen's ankles as she walked. The morning routine had become sacred to them both. While Helen prepared her tea and toast, Mochi impatiently waited for her own breakfast, performing an elaborate dance of figure eights around Helen's feet. It was in these quiet moments that Helen felt most grateful for the impulse that had led her to the animal shelter that rainy Saturday afternoon. She hadn't planned to adopt a cat that day. In fact, she had only gone to drop off some old blankets in response to the shelter's donation appeal. But something about the tiny gray kitten pressed against the bars of her cage, curious eyes wide and outstretched paw reaching forward, had called to Helen's heart. "You were quite persistent, weren't you?" Helen mused. Setting down Mochi's food bowl, she watched as the kitten attacked her breakfast with characteristic enthusiasm, purring loudly between bites. Helen settled at her small kitchen table, warming her hands around her teacup as she gazed out the window at the city awakening below. Morning traffic was picking up, and the first rays of sunlight had begun to glint off the surrounding building's windows. Her daughter Janet had been skeptical when Helen first mentioned adopting a kitten. "Mom, are you sure you can handle a young cat at your age?" she had asked, concern evident in her voice. "Maybe an older, calmer cat would be better." But Helen had known exactly what she was doing. After George's passing 3 years ago, the silence in their apartment had grown increasingly oppressive. Their children, Janet and Michael, lived in different states with their own families, and while they called regularly and visited when they could, Helen had felt the weight of solitude pressing in on her. Mochi finished her breakfast and hopped onto Helen's lap, kneading her legs before settling into a comfortable curl. Helen stroked the soft fur, feeling the steady rhythm of the kitten's purrs against her thigh. "You know what, little one," she whispered, scratching behind Mochi's ears. "I think we were meant to find each other." The kitten's only response was to purr louder, but Helen didn't need words to understand. In just 3 weeks, this small creature had transformed her apartment from a museum of memories into a home filled with new life and possibility. As she sipped her tea and watched the city come alive outside her window, Helen felt a contentment she hadn't experienced in years. The day stretched ahead of them, full of potential for small adventures and quiet moments of companionship. Little did she know that this peaceful morning marked the beginning of a journey that would change not only her life, but the lives of many others in their apartment building. As Mochi dozed in her lap and the sun climbed higher in the sky, the wheels of fate were already in motion, setting the stage for an extraordinary series of events that would test their courage, bring strangers together, and prove that family could be found in the most unexpected places. As spring mellowed into early summer, Helen found herself drawn to the building's communal balcony more frequently. The 7th floor space offered a pleasant retreat from the apartment's confines, with its collection of potted plants and comfortable chairs maintained by the residents' collective efforts. That particular afternoon seemed perfect for Mochi's first outdoor adventure. The air was warm but not stifling,
carrying the sweet scent of blooming flowers from the nearby park. Helen had carefully planned this excursion, waiting until Mochi seemed settled enough in her new home to handle new experiences. "Look at the world, sweetheart," Helen cooed, holding Mochi securely in her arms as they stepped onto the balcony. The kitten's ears twitched at the symphony of city sounds, car horns, distant conversations, and the gentle rustle of leaves in the breeze. At first, Mochi seemed content to observe from the safety of Helen's embrace, her green eyes wide with wonder as she took in the new sights and smells. Encouraged by the kitten's calm demeanor, Helen settled into one of the wooden chairs, loosening her hold slightly to let Mochi explore her lap. "Isn't this nice?" Helen smiled, watching as Mochi's nose twitched at the unfamiliar scents. "We could make this our afternoon routine, you and I." But the peaceful moment was short-lived. A pigeon landed on the balcony railing, catching Mochi's attention. Before Helen could tighten her grip, the kitten shot from her lap like a gray bullet, every muscle focused on the unsuspecting bird. "Mochi, no!" Helen's cry came too late. The pigeon took flight, but Mochi was already on the railing, her small body precariously balanced on the narrow ledge. The 7-story drop yawned beneath her, a terrifying void of open air and distant concrete. Helen's heart seemed to stop. She rose slowly, her hands trembling as she tried not to startle the kitten. "Stay still, baby," she pleaded, her voice quavering. "Please, just stay still." Mochi meowed plaintively, her tail whipping back and forth as she realized her predicament. The morning traffic continued below, oblivious to the drama unfolding above, while Helen's world narrowed to the sight of her beloved kitten teetering on the edge of disaster. "Help!" Helen called out, her voice stronger now, powered by desperation. "Someone, please help." The door to the balcony burst open, and Peter Martinez, the retired firefighter from apartment 7C, emerged. His weathered face took in the situation in an instant, decades of emergency response training kicking in. "Don't move," he instructed Helen calmly, even as Maria Rodriguez from 7A appeared behind him, her dark eyes widening at the scene. "Oh, Dios mío," Maria whispered, then turned to shout down the hallway. "We need help out here. Bring blankets." Peter inched forward, his movements deliberate and smooth. "I'm going to try something," he said, disappearing briefly into his apartment and returning with a long-handled broom. "We use similar techniques for scared cats during my firefighting days." Maria had already sprung into action, organizing the growing crowd of neighbors who had responded to her call. "Hold the blanket taut," she directed, helping to position people around the balcony's perimeter. "If she falls, we need to be ready." The next few moments seemed to stretch into eternity. Peter extended the broom slowly toward Mochi, trying to provide her with a bridge back to safety. The kitten watched the approaching broom with uncertain eyes, her small body trembling. "Come on, sweetheart," Helen whispered, her heart pounding so hard she could barely hear her own words. "Come back to me." But whether it was the breeze that suddenly gusted across the balcony, or simply fate taking its course, Mochi's next movement would be burned into Helen's memory forever. The kitten's paw slipped, and in a horrible instant, she was falling. The world seemed to move in slow motion. Helen's scream merged with the gasps of her neighbors as Mochi's gray form tumbled through the air. The makeshift rescue team tensed, adjusting their grip on the blanket, tracking the kitten's descent with determined focus. And then, miraculously, Mochi landed in the center of the outstretched blanket. The force of her fall caused the fabric to dip dramatically, but the neighbors held firm, preventing her from bouncing out. Helen's legs gave way beneath her, and she sank to the balcony floor. Maria was already gathering Mochi from the blanket, checking her for injuries before bringing her to Helen's trembling arms. "Mi amor, she's okay," Maria soothed as Helen clutched the shaking kitten to her chest. "She's scared, but she's okay." The balcony erupted in relieved cheers and exclamations, neighbors patting each other on the back and gathering around Helen to offer support. Peter knelt beside her, his experienced eyes assessing both Helen and Mochi. "Let's get you both inside," he said gently. "And then we'll have someone take a look at this little daredevil, just to be safe." As the adrenaline began to fade, Helen felt tears sliding down her cheeks, tears of relief, gratitude, and overwhelming love for both her precious kitten and the neighbors who had come together to save her. This was the moment that would change everything, though Helen didn't know it yet. As she allowed Peter and Maria to help her to her feet, still cradling Mochi close, the bonds of community were already strengthening, weaving together the lives of those who had shared in this heart-stopping rescue. In the days following Mochi's dramatic rescue, Helen's apartment became a hub of unexpected activity. Neighbors who had previously exchanged nothing more than polite nods in the hallway now stopped by regularly, bearing everything from home-cooked meals to cat toys. Sarah Chin from apartment 7D proved to be an unexpected blessing. The 28-year-old veterinary student had been in class during the balcony incident, but upon hearing about it, she immediately offered her help. "The sprain isn't severe," Sarah explained during her first visit, her gentle hands examining Mochi's left front paw. The kitten, usually squirmy during examinations, remained surprisingly still under Sarah's touch, but we'll need to keep her calm for a few weeks while it heals. Helen watched from her armchair, grateful for the young woman's expertise and kindness. "I don't know how to thank you, Sarah. You've been so helpful." Sarah looked up from her examination, her dark eyes warm behind her round glasses. "No thanks needed, Mrs. Cooper. I'm just glad I can help." She paused, scratching behind Mochi's ears. "Besides, this little one is quite the celebrity in the building now. Everyone's rooting for her recovery." It was true. The rescue had transformed the apartment building's social dynamics. Maria brought over her famous chicken soup, insisting that both Helen and Mochi needed strengthening. Peter stopped by daily to check on them, often sharing stories from his firefighting days that made Helen laugh despite her lingering anxiety. Even Mr. Thompson, the usually gruff building superintendent, softened. He installed additional safety netting on the balcony and brought Mochi a catnip mouse, grumbling that it was just something I had lying around. But it was Sarah who became a constant presence in Helen's life. The young woman's visits extended beyond just checking on Mochi's recovery. She would often stay for tea, sharing stories about her veterinary studies or listening to Helen's tales about her life with George. "He would have loved Mochi," Helen said one evening, watching as the kitten dozed in her new bed, her injured paw carefully tucked beneath her. George always had a soft spot for animals, especially the mischievous ones. Sarah smiled, cradling her teacup. "Tell me more about him." And so Helen did, finding it easier than ever before to share memories of her late husband. She told Sarah about George's terrible jokes, his passion for gardening, and how he proposed to her at a baseball game, dropping the ring into her popcorn box. "You two must have had such wonderful adventures together," Sarah said, her eyes bright with genuine interest. Helen nodded, surprised to find that talking about George now brought more comfort than pain. "We did. But you know what, I think he'd be happy to know. I'm having new adventures, even if they're not quite what I expected." As the weeks passed, Mochi's paw healed, and her confidence gradually returned. She remained more cautious around heights, but her playful spirit was undimmed. Sarah helped Helen create safe spaces for the kitten to explore, setting up window perches with secure screening and interactive toys to keep her entertained indoors. One particularly meaningful evening, about a month after the incident, Sarah arrived looking unusually nervous. She handed Helen an envelope, fidgeting with her glasses as Helen opened it. Inside was a beautiful hand-drawn portrait of Mochi, captured in careful strokes of colored pencil. The artist had perfectly captured the kitten's bright green eyes and the distinctive tabby markings that swirled across her fur. "I used to draw a lot in high school," Sarah explained hurriedly. "I'm a bit rusty, but I wanted to give you something to commemorate Mochi's recovery." Helen felt tears welling in her eyes as she studied the portrait. "Oh, Sarah, it's beautiful. You've captured her perfectly." She looked up at the young woman who had become such an important part of her life. "You know, you've given me so much more than just this drawing." Sarah settled beside Helen on the couch, and Mochi immediately claimed a spot between them, purring contentedly. "You've given me something too, Mrs. Cooper. I lost my grandmother last year, before I moved here for veterinary school. Being here, sharing tea and stories with you, it's helped heal something I didn't even realize was still hurting." The two women sat in comfortable silence, sharing the warmth of their growing friendship as the city lights began to twinkle outside the window. Neither could have predicted how their lives would soon change again, as forces beyond their control would test the bonds they'd formed. But for now, in the peaceful evening light, with Mochi purring between them, they simply enjoyed the gift of each other's company, unaware that their story was far from over. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, its official city seal standing out starkly against the white envelope. Helen had just finished her morning routine with Mochi when she discovered it among her usual mail. As she read the contents, her hands began to shake, causing Mochi to look up from her breakfast with concern. "Notice of building demolition and resident relocation," the header proclaimed in bold letters. The words that followed were equally devastating. The building had been purchased by a development company, and all residents would need to vacate within 6 months. Helen sank into her kitchen chair, the letter trembling in her grip. This apartment wasn't just her home, it was her sanctuary, filled with 40 years of memories. The wallpaper in the living room still bore the slight discoloration where George's favorite painting had hung. The kitchen counter had the small nick from when Janet had dropped a pot during her first attempt at cooking Thanksgiving dinner. Every corner held a story, a piece of her history. The sound of a key in her door lock pulled Helen from her thoughts. Sarah had taken to coming by in the mornings before her classes, a routine that had developed naturally over the past few months. "Mrs. Cooper," Sarah called out cheerfully, then stopped short when she saw Helen's face. "What's wrong?" Helen wordlessly handed over the letter, watching as Sarah's expression shifted from confusion to shock to anger as she read. "They can't do this," Sarah protested, but even as she said it, they both knew it wasn't true. 6 months, that's barely enough time to find a new place, let alone deal with everything else. "I don't even know where to begin," Helen admitted, her voice small. Mochi, sensing her distress, jumped into her lap, pressing her head against Helen's chest. "This has been my home since George and I were newlyweds. All my neighbors, my memories." Sarah pulled up a chair, reaching across the table to squeeze Helen's hand. "You're not alone in this. We'll figure it out together." As news of the demolition spread through the building, it became clear that Helen wasn't the only one struggling. Maria, a single mother, worried about finding another apartment close to her children's school. Peter, who had lived in the building almost as long as Helen, spoke of retirement communities with barely concealed disdain. The residents gathered in the community room that evening. Their usual monthly meeting transformed into a crisis discussion. The atmosphere was tense with anxiety and anger as people shared their concerns and brainstormed solutions. "We could fight this," suggested Mr. Rodriguez from the 3rd floor, his legal background showing. "Look into the historical significance of the building. Challenge the permits." "That could take years," Maria pointed out, "and we only have 6 months." As the discussion continued, Sarah sat quietly beside Helen, her mind working. Finally, she spoke up, her voice clear above the worried murmurs. "What if we helped each other?" she suggested. "Instead of everyone searching separately, we could pool our resources, share information about available properties. Maybe even look into areas where several of us could relocate together." The idea caught on quickly. Peter offered to create a spreadsheet of available properties in their price range. Maria knew a reliable moving company through her work. Even Mr. Thompson grudgingly provided a list of buildings with good superintendents. But later that night, as Helen prepared for bed, the reality of her situation truly hit her. She stood in her bedroom, looking at the familiar walls, the window where she and George had watched countless sunsets, the corner where Mochi now had her bed. "What are we going to do, little one?" she whispered to the kitten, who was watching her with those understanding green eyes. A soft knock at her door revealed Sarah, still in her scrubs from her evening shift at the veterinary clinic. "I thought you might want some company," she said, holding up a pint of ice cream and 2 spoons. As they sat on Helen's couch, sharing ice cream and watching Mochi chase her favorite toy mouse, Sarah cleared her throat nervously. "I've been thinking," she began, fiddling with her spoon. "My lease is up in 4 months anyway, and I've been looking at houses with yards better for when I start my practice. What if?" She paused, gathering courage. "What if we looked for a place together?" Helen stared at her young friend, surprised. "Together?" Sarah nodded eagerly. "It makes sense, doesn't it? We already spend most of our time together, and Mochi adores you both. Plus, I could help with maintenance and heavy lifting, and you could help me study by quizzing me on veterinary terms." As Sarah continued listing the practical benefits, Helen felt something warm bloom in her chest. Hope, perhaps, or the recognition that sometimes the end of one chapter could lead to the beginning of something even better. "And you're sure you want to live with an old woman and her troublemaking cat?" Helen asked, half joking but needing to be certain. Sarah's response was immediate and heartfelt. "You're not just an old woman, Mrs. Cooper. Your family." The word hung in the air between them, full of meaning and possibility. Mochi chose that moment to jump onto the coffee table, sending their empty ice cream container clattering to the floor, and both women burst out laughing. As they cleaned up the mess together, Helen realized that maybe home wasn't just about the walls that surrounded you or the memories they held. Maybe it was also about the people who filled your life with laughter and understanding, who stood beside you when storms gathered, and who helped you find new beginnings when old doors closed. The search for a new home began in earnest. Every weekend, Helen and Sarah would set out together, armed with listings and determination. Mochi, now fully recovered and more cautious after her adventure, watched from her window perch as they left each morning, secure in the knowledge they would return with stories of their house hunting expeditions. Their requirements seemed simple at first: a ground floor space or small house with enough room for both of them, a garden for Sarah's dream of a home veterinary practice, and a safe environment for Mochi. But finding the right place proved more challenging than expected. Too dark, Helen would say of one property. Too far from the clinic, Sarah would note about another. Not enough character, they'd both agree, exchanging knowing looks. It was during their 4th weekend of searching that they found it. The house sat on a quiet street just outside the bustling city center, its weathered brick facade partially covered with climbing ivy. A for sale sign swayed gently in the breeze, as if beckoning them forward. "Oh," Sarah breathed as they stepped through the iron gate. The front garden, though overgrown, held promise with its mature trees and forgotten flower beds. Can you imagine what this could become? Helen could. In her mind's eye, she saw Sarah's veterinary clinic in the converted garage, a garden bursting with flowers and herbs, and Mochi safely exploring the enclosed yard. The house itself, with its 2 stories and warm wooden details, seemed to welcome them home. The real estate agent, Mrs. Martinez, led them through the rooms. The ground floor had a spacious living room with a bay window, perfect for Mochi's people watching habits. The kitchen needed updating, but had good bones and enough space for Helen to continue her baking projects. Upstairs, 2 bedrooms and a study offered plenty of room for both women to have their private spaces. The previous owner was an artist, Mrs. Martinez explained, showing them the study with its north-facing windows. She designed the space for optimal natural light. Helen watched as Sarah gravitated toward the windows, imagining her young friend studying there, surrounded by veterinary textbooks and her drawings. The room held the same peaceful energy as their afternoon tea sessions. "What do you think?" Sarah asked, turning to Helen with hopeful eyes. Helen smiled, remembering another moment 40 years ago, when she and George had stood in their apartment for the first time. "I think," she said carefully, "that we should make an offer." The next few weeks passed in a whirlwind of paperwork, negotiations, and planning. Their neighbors from the apartment building rallied around them once again. Peter helped inspect the house's structure, pointing out areas that needed attention, but ultimately giving his approval. Maria connected them with her brother, a contractor who could help with the necessary renovations. The day they got the keys, Helen and Sarah stood in the empty living room, their voices echoing slightly in the unfurnished space. Sunlight streamed through the bay window, creating patterns on the hardwood floor. "Welcome home," Sarah said softly, squeezing Helen's hand. They had decided to move in stages, starting with essential furniture and gradually transferring their lives from the apartment. The first major addition was Mochi's carefully planned introduction to her new territory. Sarah had researched the best ways to help cats adjust to new environments, and they followed her plan meticulously. They set up a safe room for Mochi with her familiar belongings, allowing her to explore the rest of the house at her own pace. To their delight, Mochi adapted quickly. Within days, she had claimed various sunny spots throughout the house as her own. Though she showed a particular fondness for the bay window seat they'd installed specifically for her. As summer turned to fall, the house transformed under their care. The garden bloomed with late-season flowers, and Sarah's clinic renovation progressed steadily. Helen's kitchen became a warm hub of activity, filling the house with the scent of baking bread and brewing tea. One evening, as they sat in their new living room sharing dinner, Helen noticed something remarkable. The ache of leaving her old apartment had been replaced by a different feeling. Not the erasure of those precious memories, but their gentle incorporation into a new chapter of her life. "I was thinking," Sarah said, breaking into Helen's thoughts, "maybe we could host a housewarming party. Invite everyone from the building." Helen smiled, watching Mochi pad across the room to settle between them on the couch. "That sounds wonderful, though we should probably wait until after you finish your exams next week." Sarah laughed, reaching down to scratch Mochi's ears. "Always looking out for me, aren't you?" "That's what family does," Helen replied simply. As night fell outside their windows, the three of them sat contentedly in their new home. The house creaked and settled around them, adding its voice to their shared story. In the garden, the first autumn leaves began their dance to the ground, nature's gentle reminder that endings could be beautiful, and beginnings even more so. The housewarming party took place on a crisp October afternoon, with golden sunlight filtering through the newly cleaned windows. The house filled with familiar faces and voices as their former neighbors from the apartment building arrived, each bringing food, gifts, and stories to share. Maria's children chased each other through the garden, while their mother set up a table of her famous empanadas in the kitchen. Peter proudly showed off the security system he'd helped install, particularly the cat-proof screens on all the windows, a feature that made everyone laugh while understanding its importance. "No more aerial adventures for this one," he said, watching Mochi observe the party from her window perch. Sarah had arranged the living room furniture to create comfortable conversation areas, and Helen marveled at how naturally their styles had blended. Her antique side tables complemented Sarah's modern sofa, while photographs of both their families shared space on the walls, telling the story of their unconventional family. "You've created something special here, mister," Thompson commented gruffly, accepting a cup of tea from Helen. The former superintendent had retired rather than transferred to another building, and Helen was touched that he'd made the journey to their housewarming. "We all did," Helen replied, gesturing to the gathered crowd. None of this would have happened without that day on the balcony. As if on cue, Mochi sauntered into the room, accepting pets and treats from her admirers with regal grace. The tiny kitten who had caused such chaos had grown into a confident cat, though she still wore the same bell-adorned collar, a reminder to always know where she was. The afternoon wore on, filled with laughter and conversation. Sarah's veterinary classmates mingled with Helen's old neighbors, creating new connections and friendships. In the kitchen, Maria taught Sarah's friend Lisa the secret to her empanada dough, While in the garden, Peter discussed plant care with Helen's son Michael, who had flown in for the occasion. Janet, Helen's daughter, pulled her mother aside during a quiet moment. "Mom, I need to apologize," she said, watching Sarah across the room as she showed some children how to properly pet Mochi. "I was wrong to worry about you living alone, and I was really wrong about you moving in with Sarah. You seem happier than I've seen you since Dad passed." Helen hugged her daughter, touched by the admission. "Life has a way of surprising us," she said softly. "Sometimes, the best families are the ones we choose." As evening approached, Sarah called everyone's attention. She stood in the center of the living room, looking slightly nervous but determined. "I have an announcement to make," she began, adjusting her glasses. "As most of you know, I've been working toward opening my own veterinary practice. Well, thanks to Helen's support and all of your help, I'm officially opening next month." Cheers erupted around the room. Sarah waited for them to quiet before continuing. "And I've decided to name it Mochi's Memorial Veterinary Clinic, because without one very adventurous kitten, none of us would be here today." Helen felt tears welling in her eyes as Sarah unveiled the clinic's logo, a stylized gray cat with bright green eyes, perched safely on a window ledge. The design incorporated elements from Sarah's drawing of Mochi, the one she'd given Helen months ago during the kitten's recovery. Later that night, after the last guest had departed and the house had been restored to order, Helen, Sarah, and Mochi sat in their favorite spots in the living room. The autumn evening had turned cool, and Sarah had lit a fire in the restored fireplace, its warm glow adding to the cozy atmosphere. "I'd say that was a success," Sarah said, curled up on one end of the sofa with her feet tucked under her. "More than that," Helen replied from her armchair. "It felt like a proper beginning." Mochi, who had been dozing on her window seat, jumped down and settled between them, a living bridge between past and present. Outside, the garden lay quiet under the rising moon, waiting for the next season's growth. Inside, the house held the lingering warmth of friendship and family, both old and new. Helen looked around the room, taking in the subtle signs of their shared life. Sarah's textbooks stacked beside vintage novels, fresh flowers in Helen's favorite vase, Mochi's toys scattered about. The space spoke of both comfort and possibility, of memories treasured and adventures yet to come. "You know," Helen said thoughtfully, stroking Mochi's soft fur, "when I first moved to the apartment building with George, I thought that would be our forever home. I never imagined I'd find another one, especially not like this." Sarah smiled, understanding in her eyes. "Maybe that's the best kind of home, the one you never saw coming." As they sat together in comfortable silence, Helen reflected on the journey that had brought them here. From a lonely widow to a fall that changed everything, from the kindness of neighbors to this unexpected family she'd found. Through it all, one small gray cat had been the catalyst, the tiny harbinger of change who had brought them all together. Mochi purred contentedly, safe in the knowledge that some falls led not to disaster, but to something better, to open hearts, to new beginnings, and to the kind of love that built homes stronger than any walls could contain.